Hello, everyone. Welcome to part two in our Balancing Developer and Tester Testing in the Modern SDLC webinar. My name is Christine and I'll be your moderator. Today's webinar features Logigear's Michael Hackett. Today's agenda is as follows. In part one, Michael talked about new SDLC ideas on developer testing, test team testing, and QA. In part two, Michael will discuss what does this look like and closing thoughts. A few housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded and will be available within 48 hours, and this webinar will run about 50 minutes. Take it away, Michael.
Hi again, everybody. We're going to pick up with part two of this presentation on developer and tester testing and the redistribution of tasks. Part one focused on SDLC changes, culture changes that are happening that are accelerating the shift around between shifting left, shifting more testing tasks earlier to developers and ownership of quality and quality at every step and a bunch of the SDLC and culture practices that are going on in this environment of modern SDLC. And what I want to do now is talk more about low-level details of how developers and testers work together and distribute their tasks. Part two of this presentation is going to focus on low-level developer testing and tester testing. They've always been different. The mindsets have been different, and I want to dive into that a little bit more and look again at some of the tasks that have to get distributed and what skills have to be learned to distribute those tasks and what kind of management ideas managers need to work on with their teams if they're going to distribute these tasks more successfully. So I want to talk about the mindset of developers and testers first. And mindset's a really crucial thing to how developers develop and how testers test. And I am borrowing from a man, Brett Petticore. He did a lot of really great work and great thinking about how testers test and how developers test. More along the lines of how traditional developers think and how traditional testers think. And I want to talk about how those have evolved into where we are now. So I'm referencing Brett's original work on traditional developers and traditional testers. So thinking in terms of permutations, developers think in terms of functions, where testers think more in terms of input data and states. When I talk about a lot of functional examples, I'll just say, this kind of data, that kind of data, boundary data, corner case data, rare data, illegal data. I'm thinking in terms of kind of external forces on this input data and states rather than the individual function by itself. Developers think more in terms of the product. Testers think more in terms of platforms that are going to support that product. Developers think more in terms of the system and having the system work holistically, where testers think more in terms of external factors on the system. Developers think more in terms of function and having the function work. Testers think more in terms of expectations of the customer, expectations of users of how that function is going to work. Developers think more in terms of single product. Testers think more in terms of versions of the product. Now, these different ideas and different approaches to the function and the product are going to have an impact on test case design, right? So function, product, system, developers write tests and focus on testing and their thinking, their mindset internally, right? And how this internal system is going to work. Testers think external, outside, input from the outside, various platforms, expectations, versions. Testers think differently and therefore find different types of bugs than developers think and how they build the system and how they might test it. More importantly are these kind of psychological differences and mindset differences to how developers and testers think differently. Developers are builders. They make things strong. They build it up. They make it work. They make it strong. What do testers do? They rip apart, shred, and break down. That's a fundamental difference to how these two roles approach the system. Um, Developers build, testers break, and that's a good thing. We need that. We want that. When I talk about traditional developers, where developers think a certain way, testers think a certain way. In the old days, where if a tester entered a bug, a developer could say that's not in the requirements, get it out of the bug tracking system, or a tester enters a bug and a developer could say, that's not a bug, that's a user error. That's not, I'm not going to fix that because that's a user's problem, not ours. Those days are gone. Where most developers today, they want good testing, they want testers to shred it and to break it, because frankly, from my perspective as a developer, I'd rather I don't want to get support tickets. I'd rather have testers find bugs than get support tickets later on. I'd rather start a user story and finish it now, find everything we need to get now, so I can move on to other things, instead of leaving technical debt, or we get some support issues later on that mean I have to go back and fix some function in a user story that we already finished. But also, as a developer, I want good learning about the function. I want to see the behaviors. I want somebody to exercise it thoroughly to make a more resilient and a more stable function. They're not so much traditional roles that are separate anymore. There is more of a cross thinking and cross function between developers and testers. But this is something to work toward. The developers being builders and testers being shredders trying to break. When I've worked with teams on having developers get more skilled at testing, it's like wearing two hats. It's like playing two different sports, right? So we're located in Silicon Valley. I think, like, when I'm developing, I'm writing code, I'm playing baseball, I'm on the San Francisco Giants and I'm playing baseball, and that's what I do. When it comes to testing, I take that hat off and I put on a Warriors hat, and I'm playing basketball. I'm playing a different sport. I'm doing a different thing. I'm acting differently. It is that different, I think, for developers to switch roles and do that breaking, shredding kind of thing. So it's playing different sports, it's acting differently, thinking differently, wearing different hats. Next, developers need tunnel vision. Testers need a broad vision. So developers, I want them to have a narrow focus. I want them to have tunnel vision. Testers, I want them to be able to take a step back from the user story and have a broader vision. And this is difficult for one person to do. Developers test for function. Developers validate, right? Testers test for failures. They look for failures. They try and break. Testing, the whole art and science of testing. Even back in part one, we had that definition from IEEE of what's QA, what's QC, what's testing. Testing is about looking for failures, exercising the application, exercising the system in a variety of ways, hoping to expose failures, hoping to find issues and find bugs. That's not what a developer's main job is. Developers validate, write a function and validate it, or if they're doing TDD, write the test and then write the code to have that test pass. Validating is different than bug finding. So they're separate sets of tasks that a good product of good quality is going to have both, right? That we have to validate functions. The functions have to work, but we also have to look for bugs and try and break it and use it in ways that are going to expose failures. And last, testers can be naive, but developers have to be experts. Testers can be naive, and I don't mean this in a way where in the old days, testers might be criticized because they might be naive. If I hired subject matter experts, or I have business analysts who are focused on a usage, right? If we're making an accounting app and I hire some BAs who know about accounting, know how accounting works, and these business analysts know about accounting, I don't need them to be coding experts. I don't need them to understand the architecture of the solution. In a way, I want them to be a bit naive, because I don't want testers to censor their tests because of their knowledge of the code, right? I'd rather have black box testing complement white box testing. I'd rather have testers being a little bit naive than the white box, where if I know how the system is built and I know the language and I know how the system is built, I might say, okay, this is only going to accept numerical values, so I'm not going to try alpha characters. Or I know this is only going to accept this certain type of data, so I'm only going to test with that data, even if it's not overt. If it's an unconscious thing, I don't want to unconsciously bias my testing because I know about the system architecture, right? So testers can be naive, and that's a good thing, but developers have to be experts. So what I'm trying to drive home in these couple of slides, testers and developers have different jobs. They've always had different jobs. They have different skill sets. They have different perspectives, where developers look more internally, testers look more externally. Developers need tunnel vision, testers need broad vision. Developers validate, where testers look for failure. These separate roles, they complement each other in releasing a high quality product. And if I'm going to have this trend where my developers take on more testing responsibility, that's fine. And we're going to talk about it as this session goes on. It doesn't lessen the need for some testing for failures, taking a step back from the function and looking at the broader picture, testing for failures and trying to break it. Right? They're different skills, they're different tasks. The bigger issues for developers taking on testing tests is really a mindset change. It's working beyond the developer responsibility, thinking about what is testing really about. Testing is not just about checking or validating that this function works. Testing is about looking for failures. If developers are going to be taking on more testing responsibility, how do you test and what do you test? I said a couple of times in part one of this that testing is an art and testing is a science, and well-trained testers have a broad range of skills. It didn't happen accidentally. The testing craft has evolved over time, and learning how to test and what to test it's a full practice. There's a culture to it, and it has a practice that's really grown over decades. So in addition to the mindset change, there are also practice changes. So if I was going to oversimplify this discussion that we just had, testers break, developers build. Different tasks, different skills. Testers discover and explore, doing exploratory testing and just discovering. I can try things with 5 different pieces of data and discover things that frankly developers validate. They might run a unit test with, 1 piece of data or in one situation. They're probably not going to try it 5 different ways. Because that's just how testers work, and testers find bugs and errors that customers find that are maybe not scoped in the user story. And if you have really cooperative users that are very tolerant of issues, very tolerant of bugs, you have easy rollbacks, you have easy rollout of new functionality. If you have really understanding customers that are very accepting of bugs in a positive way to get delivered functionality faster, that's great. But if your users are picky, they're complainers, you're in a very competitive market, somebody needs to be finding those bugs, discovering those exploratory type bugs. That is the test team's main job. Testers test based on use and users, like particularly from a user interface, from a user's perspective, black box type testing. Developers test based on code. Developers focus more on white box testing, which is fine. It's that balance between black box and white box testing. And if you're going to shift tasks, we can't shortchange those things. Learning about the system and learning about the behaviors, right? Discovering how it works, acting like a customer, testing like a customer, testing workflows, testing tasks. Tasks meaning first I do function 1, then function 2, then function 3, then go back and edit function 2, then do function 3, 4, 5. Testing workflows, testing ease of use, internal customers and external customers both. Learning about the system requires a whole bunch of tests that are this is like hardcore, this is testing work, that is what they're particularly skilled in. Do your developers have the time to do this, and do they have the skills to do this? Because I don't think that anybody wants to lose these types of tests. The idea of developers testing their own code is great. I'm all for developer testing. That's not my focus. if anything, would be to get more developer testing. Shift left, quality at every step, great cultural movements. In software development, it can streamline downstream testing. It can cut costs by finding a bunch of functional bugs through unit testing early rather than finding functional bugs in system testing. But it's those other tests, those integration, workflow, environment, platform, user type areas that developers just aren't focused on finding. And what I think is they often get lost when developers take over a bunch of testing and the test teams get reduced or get eliminated. It's these types of tests that get lost that I'm saying somebody needs to do these. They just can't get, they can't disappear. So developers and testers don't have the same mindset. Even in modern software development, a function still has to be developed, right? You develop a function, you get a user story and you write a function. It has to be validated, explored, discovered. It has to be, built out, done, and it has to be, well tested. I think more than just at the unit level. But then after that, after you have a solid function that's going to roll out with into a product, automation scripts have to be built and designed and built to show consistency. Once this function rolls out, that it doesn't break, that a new function that you add later or some refactoring that goes on isn't going to break the existing functions or even the features that the users see. Automation has to be built around these tasks. Can devs do this? Sure. But they need skills, they need training, they need knowledge of the user, thinking like the user, they need creativity, because a whole lot of testing is creative in a different way than software development is creative, and they need time, right? Don't underestimate the amount of time that testers use to think about and design tests. I used the word checking a little while ago, and I talked about validation. I want to talk about that a little bit. Developers validate, right? They will run a test to show that, if I add 1 + 1, I get 2. They will validate that works. Validate meaning prove. They'll check that 1 + 1 = 2. They'll check that in a certain condition, X happens. And yeah, that thing happens. X is supposed to happen and that thing happens. Or if I click on this box, then I'm going to navigate here. And somebody has to check that. If that box is unchecked, I'm going to navigate to a different place. Somebody has to check that, right? But that's checking. It's not really that testing, capital T testing. That's that bug finding, exploring, trying to break, that creative, intelligent type testing that is really a different practice than checking and validating, right? We do want to automate at the lowest level. You want to validate a bunch of that, automate a bunch of that validation testing and a bunch of that validating. You want to automate a bunch of the checking, but that's really a different type of testing there's a whole bunch of people now that are just calling that checking. They're not even calling it testing. They're check that if I'm in this condition, that happens. That's not really testing. So what do testers do? Testers and devs have different mindsets, different goals, different priorities. They have different jobs. More dev testing is great. That's fine. And this idea of having QA governance through the whole process is great. Team supporting end-to-end quality at every step. That's all great. But I want to focus on testers for a little while. And what are testers? The skills that testers have. Testers have always had, or have always wanted testers to have 3 separate skill sets. One is knowledge of the platform, right? Knowledge of the technology. If I'm working on a mobile platform, I want my test team to understand how mobile devices work, how different mobile devices work, I want them to understand Android and iOS and different platforms. And I want them to understand, native apps versus mobile browsers. And I want them to understand the technology and how the platform is built. I also want them to have knowledge of the user, right? A whole lot of testing traditionally has been knowing the user. When companies started switching to technical testers, a bunch of skills and mindset was lost on testing from a user's perspective, acting like a user. Moving to technical testers is when I think that this gap between we just don't know what the users are like, different than if I have my testers, for example, might be business analysts who are accountants. They're accountants. They know how accounting works. If I'm making an accounting app, I actually want a couple of accountants working on it, testing it, helping with the user stories, writing workflows, helping me with scenarios, knowing persona, and helping me develop tests in various persona. Part of testing is knowledge of the users, testing like users, acting like users. Then the third separate set of skills that I want a test team to have is knowing about testing and knowing about quality practices, knowing, how to figure out equivalence classes, how to figure out boundary values, what kind of testing do you do around boundary values, how to write good test cases, how to do forced error testing. There's a methodology that I teach about a lot called error guessing. It's more than just guessing about an error, but how do you do error guessing, and what goes into error guessing? How do you write test cases based on guesses for errors? There's testing skill that needs to be developed in addition to quality practices. How to write a good test plan, how to write good bug reports, how to write good test cases. Where do you test? When do you test? Issues on environments with testing. Including how to do good automation. What are some automation strategies that require less maintenance, or building more stable automation, building better automation frameworks. There's quality practices and testing skill, separate than knowledge of the user and separate than knowledge of the product and the platform and the technologies that the product uses. The reason why I wanted to talk about this today is when developers take over testing tasks, we know, okay, they better have knowledge of the platform and the technology. I count on that. I rely on that, and they're probably going to write great tests from a technical perspective and about the platform. That's fine. But I keep coming back to this knowledge of the user and writing tests like a user. We can't have that be lost. But also knowing how to find bugs, writing good tests for errors, for trying to break, for boundary cases, corner cases, based on equivalence classes, based on models. If you give me a model and I know how to do model-based testing, I can develop a whole lot of model-based tests. That is a skill that I've built over time because I trained as a tester, and that's what testers know how to do. So if you're going to redistribute tasks from traditional testers across the team, pay attention to these skills and who is going to do the types of tests that would come out of these separate skills. Because as far as I'm concerned, and I think anybody would agree, you still need technical tests. You still need tests based on knowledge of the users, and you still need just good testing practices for how to test well. What are some testing tasks? Automation, right? Testers have to automate a smoke test, a build acceptance test, build validation test, and they also have to automate, some kind of full regression automation suite. And they also have to do exploratory testing that we talked about a bunch in part one, and we're going to talk about again in a couple of minutes. But also have to automate transactions and even just write transactions, write workflows of integrating maybe more at the system level. That if I have a bunch of Scrum teams working on a bunch of individual functions, somebody has to integrate these things together. Even if I have contracts about how APIs are supposed to talk to each other, and services have to follow these structures, that's great. And sometimes people make mistakes, right? They have to be tested. So somebody has to come up with good transactions, good workflow, good end-to-end tests. And then in addition to coming up with regression automation, you have to do the maintenance. And maintenance is a big cost. So when we think back on this quadrants discussion we had in part one about agile testing, is who does those quadrant 3 and quadrant 4 tests? If I can say to my developers, okay, you guys are going to do the unit and integration tests, that maybe the component level tests. I might even think that there's quadrant 2 tests that traditional testers would do. That, okay, if I'm going to have my developers take those things on, the skills for quadrant 3 and the skills for quadrant 4 are very different than how most developers would test. So if I'm not going to have a test team do that kind of quadrant 3 and quadrant 4 testing, are there going to be bugs? Are there going to be bugs that those people find that your developers just don't test that way? if the devs test a certain way, and now the testers who used to test a certain way are gone, or they're not doing these same tasks, who's going to find those bugs? Now, if you tell me that there aren't bugs like that, that's great. That's fine. Let me tell you a story about this one client I have. I went and worked with this team. They make this this whole process is about 8 Scrum teams all work together on this one product that's this workflow, and you do this whole workflow, and that's the whole product. And you can, everybody has products like this, right? You have a whole bunch of Scrum teams working together to be in this workflow and have all these features work together. These features and these chunks of functionality are pretty isolated, which is fine. And I'm working with all of these teams, and I talked to the director, and I said to her, we were talking about things, and I said, I want to ask you about bugs. I said, bugs, support tickets, things that come in. Are the bugs that get found, are they in individual functions? Are some teams stronger than others? Or some teams, they do a really good job testing, and some teams, they don't do a good job testing? So do you find teams in individual functions and in individual feature areas, in individual chunks of these tools? Or are most of the bugs integration bugs, workflow, communicating back and forth, API level, service level, these things talking to each other, level bugs? And she kind of looked at me funny and laughed, and she said, we never find individual function bugs. She said, my teams are great and they all know how to test, but they all test their own little functionality. In perspective, they all test their functional area. It's when this thing gets integrated, it's a mess, and there's breaks, and 100% of our support tickets come from integration problems, issues not found during integration testing, because these 8 separate teams all work really hard at making robust individual functions, but they just don't do they don't do enough, they don't do knowledgeable, they don't do sophisticated workflow testing. That's where all of their errors and all of their support tickets come from, the integration type testing that is really the quadrant 3 and quadrant 4 tests. And it's that I have here, this, whether it's user acceptance testing or end-to-end or scenario. I've been using these words in a string through this part 1 and part 2. If you're listening to this, you know what I mean by that, whether it's testing that you'd run on a system environment or a UAT environment or a staging environment, testing across browsers, multiple character sets, if I'm doing localization, the automation of the localization test, all of those types of traditional tester type tests, who's doing those? Knowing that my developers and my testers think so differently, if I'm going to, I mean this in a jarring way, if I'm going to dump all these tests on my developers and say, okay, if you write it, you own it, right? You write this function, you write this one piece of this workflow, you own it the whole way through. So you need to be writing integration tests that include that function in it. That is a pretty heavy weight to dump on a developer who's really focused on that internal, inside, making it robust, making it strong, internal focus, to all of a sudden say, okay, now you have to start looking at external factors, integration, platforms. I want you to think differently about your whole functional area. In theory, that's fine. Growing in skills, getting more skills is fine, but think about how much time it's going to take. And if you automate it, how much automation time, but then automation maintenance is going to go into these tasks and where those tasks are going to land. These are traditional testing things. I call it testing 101. Testing 101 is looking for gaps, trying to break, right? That's very different than what most developers do. That developer validation is not looking for gaps. Testers, this is hardcore testing where, let me sink my teeth into it. I'm going to try and break it. I'm going to look for gaps. I'm going to try data that people haven't thought about yet. I'm going to look for breaks. If there's gaps in the user story, if there's parts of the user story that weren't fully fleshed out, that might have been missed by the PO or missed during sprint planning, but I'm looking for gaps in the user story. And then this idea of exploratory testing, gray box testing. Gray box, it's a little black box, it's a little white box. Love to talk about gray box testing more. Error guessing, I mentioned before, forced error testing. Exploratory testing, just knowledge of the user, knowledge of the platform, knowledge of testing, exploring the application and learning about it more, this is testing 101. This is what testers' jobs are, and it's a big set of skills to ask a developer to take on. So I want to step into another piece for a minute and talk about, I brought up this idea of user stories a couple of times in this, and requirements analysis and user stories. How many times have I heard developers say to me, I will build you what you want. Just tell me what you want, right? If you don't tell me what you want, I'm going to just build what I think you want. And that always leads to a mismatch. So I will build you anything. I can build you anything you want, right? Just tell me what you want. How good are your user stories? Are there gaps? Do the POs even have a great knowledge and understanding of your customers? How much do the user stories evolve over time? And do they include low-level details? Like some user stories do a decent job at capturing what the use is and how the function should work. How much detail is there in the user story about the error handling and what the error conditions are and how you want to trap for those errors? All of these questions that I just brought up are going to impact how you distribute these tasks, because again, it's tester 101 to find gaps, to test around low-level details, to focus on error handling. If your user stories aren't great, it's going to deter. I'm trying to say this really politely. It's going to be a problem if you want to give the testing tasks to developers, because this really is a strong suit. It ought to be a strong suit of testers to help flesh out the user story and test for gaps and do exploratory testing around it, particularly around errors. So this, as I just brought up, this knowledge of the customer. It's every developer's job to deliver customer value. We know that. It's everybody on the whole team, from Scrum Master to PO to engineering manager to testers. We're all supposed to deliver customer value, right? But this shift in testing tasks is really only going to be possible. The testing tasks are much more focused on knowledge of the customer and knowledge of the user, where the dev tasks are more focused on the technology and the architecture and the design. So it is a bigger new area to have developers take over the customer side of things. And this is going to require constant collaboration from POs, from product management, giving much more input about what the customers do and how the customers act than most developers are used to, or even POs are used to giving. So I think I've driven home this idea enough about knowledge of the customer having a big impact on how you distribute tasks. And do the developers have good skills for test case design around customer tests, and do they have the time for that? I want to talk about one special case here for a minute. My first example over here is in Apple signing into iTunes. An unexpected error has occurred at Nike.com. An error occurred at Walmart. An unexpected runtime error occurred over in Microsoft. Over here, an unexpected error has occurred in Facebook. Something went wrong. Sorry, an unexpected error. Down below, Wells Fargo Bank, and we've encountered an error. In Netflix, there was an unexpected error. In Amazon, sorry, an unexpected error happened. So this idea of error testing, and I have an example here on Robinhood. We know Robinhood. Robinhood's great. Robinhood's opened up stock trading to a whole new group of people that weren't trading stocks before. So it's great. They've had issues. They've had a bunch of outages that I've been kind of paying attention to, with unencountered, unexpected errors. So you quick search of unexpected errors would find you some very high profile, very public bugs. Facebook's biggest outages, Robinhood's biggest outages, Bank of America's biggest outages from unexpected or unhandled errors. And if you think about these conditions or these situations, right? These situations, they're often very deep, very devious, very complex, very difficult to reproduce, unique to data sets, unique to load environments, unique to boundary cases or error cases. But every valuable tester is specifically skilled at trying to break and injecting faults. This requires training, it requires skill, and to me, the thing that I keep stressing here is it requires a lot of time. So will test teams find all these errors? No, absolutely not. No, I'm not saying that, yeah, you keep your black box test team or you have subject matter expert teams are going to find every error. They're not. Right? These things get out. Target certainly has rooms full of testers and you still get unexpected site errors. Robinhood has, rooms full of testers. You still get unhandled error conditions. But testers are much more likely to find these, right? Testers stand a much greater chance of finding concurrency issues by doing forced error tests, by doing wrong and illegal data, bad data, by doing performance testing and load testing, but also load testing that's in a stress condition, load testing in a boundary condition, running the system under a load and then trying to go in and do another boundary test, running a system under a very high load, and then going in and trying to do some forced error tests. Testers, if your testers aren't doing these types of tests, they're missing the boat. But the key part of testing, right? Concurrency, forced error, illegal data, bad data, performance testing, load testing under stress and in boundary conditions. But also, test teams go in and spend time in the system under development. They go and they spend time. So will test teams find all of these, unexpected errors or unhandled errors? No. But do they stand a greater chance at finding some? Yes. Will they find some? Absolutely. Will they, just by spending time in the application and doing the types of tester things, they'll find a bunch of these errors. I think I've kind of made my point there. Do your developers spend so much time in the system under development? Do they spend more time in the code and writing chunks of code, like on a dev environment, or do they still spend enough time in the whole system, the put together system under development? Are they doing concurrency testing, forced error testing, testing with illegal data? If developers are mainly focused on validating, they're not going to be spending so much time just messing around. And honestly, this kind of concurrency testing, forced error testing, wrong data, that's not even security testing. Security testing, pen testing, a bunch of the types of security tests that people run now, it's not testing with bad data. That's a functional test. If I just put in the wrong kind of data, that's a functional test. It's not necessarily a security test. Concurrency testing, standard testing, that's not really a security test. It's or even in performance testing, I might not even be doing specific concurrency testing. This is more like tester work. Spending time in the system. All right. So I think I've made that point. I want to also point out, if you have really understanding customers or are in a non-competitive market, it's probably fine that you don't worry about these. But if your customers are really picky, they complain a lot, your support costs are high, I would not want to be letting my software get out into production without having a team of people spend a lot of time in the situation where they're particularly looking for errors. And if you're in a non-competitive market, that's fine. But if you're in a competitive market, we kind of don't want these kinds of things happening to us. Or we really want to minimize this, right? We really want to minimize this. Of course, it's still going to happen, right? All of these companies, right? Amazon has rooms of testers. Wells Fargo has rooms of testers testing. You want to minimize these things happening out in the production world, right? So just to kind of drive home that idea of spending time in the system with the purpose of trying to break things. All right. So testing is creative, testing is detective work, it's investigating, and it takes, all of this takes time to learn, time to develop, time to write test cases, time spent in the application, in the system. That's a different job than what developers do, and we just can't let these tasks disappear. So what do test teams do? They do exploratory testing, integration testing, workflow testing, and it's automation, and that's kind of what I've been focusing on in this session. Because in my experience, when people do move developers to be doing more testing, these are the tasks that disappear. But also test teams and different teams on the development team do non-functional testing, like performance and load. We've talked about security testing, but also usability and UX. I might have a UX team. I'm going to much more heavily rely on those people to do more user-focused testing rather than just real usability testing, like counting mouse clicks and how easy is it to use and how easily understood is this, is not really functional testing or workflow testing. And also like accessibility testing, like Americans with Disability Act, Section 508 to 508 testing, non-functional tests. We still need those other types of tests done. We still need teams doing those other things in addition to the traditional testing like exploratory integration and workflow testing. So to kind of summarize this thing, exploratory testing is probably where most of your bugs are found. And that's just my experience with testing. Is exploratory testing is where we find the things that people haven't thought about. It's where we find gaps. Testing from that different perspective, like customer perspective or across devices. It's also the lean principle of just-in-time test design. So I'm not testing, exploratory testing isn't testing based on a user story necessarily. It's testing on here's how the system was built. Here's what I see. Now that I'm delivered this code or delivered this function, now I'm going to test it based on what I see. It's just-in-time test design in a way that it's much more real testing based on what the real system looks like, and how it responds, how the behaviors respond, rather than test cases I might have designed from a user story that are based on a user story and not based on a real a dynamic function in the context of the dynamic running environment, right? And this is where I find it develops to have the biggest hurdles to cross, is that time consuming, creative, based on customers, looking for gaps, exploratory testing. That's not first nature to developers. That's really testing 101, and we don't want those skills to get lost. So a couple of little things specific to automation. We know automation is essential. Everybody knows that, but who builds it and who's going to maintain it? It might be fine with my developers building a bunch of unit tests and maybe even service level tests. But when it comes to automation, there's two big issues that I always want to resolve. Companies want more and more and more automation, right? So even if you know about the automation pyramids and flipping the automation pyramids, or without going into that now, better balancing the automation strategy among UI-driven tests, API-driven tests, or unit-level tests, right? We have to have some amount of UI-driven tests. But everyone underestimates the cost of maintaining those tests. If you have inherited a big UI-driven automation regression suite, you probably don't underestimate maintenance anymore. Maintenance kills, right? Maintenance is the biggest cost, not creating the tests, not running the tests, but maintaining these tests and then analyzing the breaks. So with this drive to automate more and having a UI, some kind of UI-driven test automation suite, or you've inherited a big UI automation suite, automation kill, maintenance costs kill, and handing this over to developers is dicey. Things can get out of date, out of maintenance, too many fails, and what happens when the automation suite becomes problematic just to run is it loses its integrity, it loses its value, it gets a bad reputation, frankly, and people think, oh, that automation suite, enough of these automation tests fail all the time that I could analyze 1,000 fails to find maybe there's not a single bug there, but it's just automated tests fail because of timeouts, tool issues, platform issues, tests that weren't maintained, all of these issues that you all know about, why tests can fail, not really leading to a bug. Somebody has to be charged with maintaining these tests. Somebody has to be charged with having a good strategy and looking towards smarter automation and lower maintenance automation. Test teams are really specifically skilled to do this, that development teams aren't. And frankly, the developers that I know, they never want to deal with that mess, with that UI automation thing. As important or as minor as it may be, that's a big stretch to get developers to manage, run, maintain, and analyze the issues found during like a UI-driven automation suite, right? So we know we have to automate a bunch of these end-to-end test scenario workflows, these transactions. It's great. We know we have to, but you know that Selenium as a tool, for example, prefers atomic or decoupled isolated tests, but that's not what your users do. So even if I have somebody automating through a UI and doing a bunch of Selenium tests, their focus is probably going to be on more atomic decoupled tests, even though it might do some UI validation and might even do some effective UI testing. Is it finding workflow integration, multiple services working with each other in an end-to-end task? Those kind of tests are harder to write, harder to maintain. There's a lot more points that they could break when that test fails. If it is an end-to-end test, there's a whole bunch more points of failure. It's going to take more time to analyze those things. A smarter automation strategy is going to help you, right, go far in having a good automated regression suite. But who has accountability for this kind of testing, for this automation in the value stream? It's typically testers, and as I've said a bunch of times during this presentation, developers kind of tend to both devalue these types of tests and not want to go near the maintenance of these things. But automation, at least some UI automation, is important, and at least some workflow transaction type automation is important. Somebody has to automate the tests that users actually do. As far as staffing goes, staffing models have really changed more dramatically than task distribution, right? With whether it's distributed teams or work from home teams or outsourced teams, task distribution for this has really changed with different staffing models, with SMEs, BAs, business analysts, technical testers, test engineers, developers taking on some of these tasks. I would suggest you remember that Venn diagram I showed earlier of what the tester skills are, like knowledge of the user, knowledge of testing, knowledge of the platform, and knowledge of technology, right? Those three separate sets of skills. Look for expertise in those areas. If you are going to have your developers do the technical testing, that's great, that's fine. Who's going to do the user type testing, and who knows enough about testing that they're going to do the tester type testing, right? Knowing how to test for boundaries and equivalence classes, model-based, a bunch of these same examples I'm using. Also look for economy, whether you're outsourced or using external people, maybe just for automation, maybe just for the testing part. The technical tests usually better wind up closer to the developer. So if I have technical testers, I might want to keep them internal to be able to collaborate better with my developers. As I said, the staffing models here have really become diverse with varieties of ways that I can staff projects. However you staff them, make sure you have good communication, transparency, collaboration about testing tasks, about who's doing what roles and responsibilities that I'm going to talk about in a minute. If you do have developers taking over a bunch of your testing tasks, they have to be trained, right? They need training, usually around mindset, but also around skills and practices around there. They also need time, and they need support to grow into these skills and more knowledge of users. This is going to require buy-in from management. I have seen a whole bunch of situations where somebody gets a great idea. We say, okay, developers are going to take on more testing. So great, developers start testing. And then the estimates go through the roof, or estimates get longer, or there's technical debt starts to be built because user stories, when they were sized, didn't include enough testing time, or testing time at all, or adequate testing time, or testing time explodes once we get into it. Once you get into the testing and realize how complex it is, or testing across devices or character sets or locales, whatever it is your team, whatever it is your product needs, particularly in the beginning, but probably even in the long term, your development estimates they're going to get longer. They might even go through the roof. With developers taking on more testing tasks. Listen, if I have developers who are going to have to take on more test automation maintenance, wow, those test estimates may get ugly. So as a manager, how to succeed with a bunch of these modern SDLC changes. from a manager's perspective, right? Shift left is great, but it has staffing implications. Make sure that with this quality at every step responsibility, every step in the value stream, everybody knows what they are responsible for, and everybody has a quality mindset. Make sure that devs, ops, QA, they all have the skills they need and the knowledge they need for quality practices, and everyone's aware of who is doing what, roles and responsibilities. What do I expect POs to do? What testing do I expect from ops? What testing do I expect from devs? What testing do I expect from a testing team, a QA team? Everyone's aware of their roles and responsibilities. And also, like I just brought up, the teams are aware that they have to estimate testing tasks, right? Because testing is a shared responsibility. Everybody owns a piece of testing. Everybody now has to do estimates that are inclusive of testing time. And that people have to be able to communicate well and easily using the same vocabulary, same language about testing, about strategy, about coverage, about bugs, that all the process pieces of testing, it's a manager's responsibility to make those things all a whole lot easier. The more I spread around testing tasks. So, closing thoughts on this developer testing thing. Software development life cycles are constantly changing, and with tasks getting redistributed, particularly with developers taking on testing tasks, organizations have to have good cultural understandings of quality at every step, shift left, fail fast. This idea of you build it, you own it, right? That if you are tasking developers with you build this function or you build this feature set, you're responsible for it the whole way through all of its testing phases, including integration and transaction. That cultural understandings have to change. Not my problem, or that's not my job. I write it. I write this function. The rest is not my job. Those kind of cultural understandings have to go. Next, test teams do a whole lot more than functional validation and functional UI automation. As I've said a bunch of times about transaction, workflow, complex breaking, exploratory testing, forced error testing, there's a whole lot more to testing than just validating functions, right? If your test team is only doing validating, functional validation, I would think that you're underusing them. So transferring testing tasks is fine, but test teams do a whole lot more than just validation. And with more developers doing validation and checking who does those testing tasks. The technical service that test teams provide is really a bridge from low-level functional, like unit testing, like low-level tests, to happy customers, less support tickets. The bridge between unit tests and happy customers and less support tickets runs through test teams and tester testing. With all these things that I've been talking about, how testers even just spend time in the system to find bugs, and don't underestimate the cost of automation and automation maintenance, because maintenance kills, right? So to summarize this, if this all sounds like something you struggle with or something you want help with, give me a call and let's talk about it. Well, I can have a conversation. I hope that this presentation and everything that we've just talked about in part one and part two of this, I hope that this has been beneficial in you getting a better grasp if you are going to redistribute these tasks and what some issues teams run into. But we can help talk about what the best solutions are and how to plan a good testing strategy and task distribution and how to handle test automation and looking at staffing alternatives to get this done. So I hope that this whole thing has been helpful in better understanding what happens when we distribute these testing tasks across the development team. So thank you. I'm glad that you came today. Thanks for spending this time listening.
Thank you for attending part 2 of our webinar. We will be sending out a recorded version of the webinar within 48 hours. If this sounds like something you struggle with or need help with, let's set up a conversation with an expert from our team. You can contact us using the information below or visiting www.logigear.com. Thank you for your time. Goodbye.